So if you guys don't know, Dr. Statland is the professor of neurology at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City, Kansas. He's the co-director of the FSHD Clinical Trial Readiness Network, and his specific research interest over the last 10 years has been preparing for clinical trials in FSHD. He has a particular interest in pediatric FSHD, and he's going to share with us what's on the horizon for pediatric trials, natural history trials, and maybe be involved in some other ongoing trials. So again, thank you, Dr. Statland, for being here and joining our group. And we will let you do your presentation. And if you have any questions as he's going along, just interrupt and ask the question. Is that how you want that to go, Dr. Statland?
Absolutely. It's a small group. If you have a question, just ask. No,
okay, perfect.
Won't bother me at all.
And you can also, I'll be monitoring the chat. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and then I'll try and jump in and ask those if you don't want to ask them on camera. I do want you guys to know that this is being recorded, and it will be put on the FSHD Society YouTube channel.
Okay, great. All right. So, I mean, thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you all tonight. I think when we think about neuromuscular disorders, there's really no question. There's really been just a sea change in both the number of clinical trials that we're seeing and the outcomes to those clinical trials. And this has largely been driven by some of the work that's done in the lab, so a better understanding of the chemistries that we're using, but also due to the rational targets that we're selecting. And this is particularly true for gene-targeted therapies. This has really changed the questions we're asking from, what causes FSHD to how can we treat it? But there's still several barriers that really exist to having clinical trials. And some of these barriers are just logistical challenges. How do we get our centers ready to do this in a rare disease where we may need centers, all over the country or all over the world? But some of this is a knowledge gap. And it's really, how do we get to the point where we really understand the disorders that we're seeing, and how do we build the tools that we're going to need so we can have high quality and efficient clinical trials? And so what I wanted to do today is share with you some of the work that me and my collaborators, because everything I do is sort of done in groups of people, have been doing to try to get ready for clinical trials. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about pediatric FSHD in particular. These are my disclosures. I do want to point out I work with, obviously, a lot of companies. Most of the work that I do with these companies is just to get them to the point where they could do studies in humans. I typically stop working for them once they have drugs on the market for a variety of reasons, just so you know. But we can talk about post-market research if we have time and people have questions about that. So what I was going to hope to go through, and please, like I said, if you have questions, just stop me. I mean, this is for you. So please, if you have a question, just ask me. But I want to talk a little bit about that drug development landscape. So where are we today? I was going to spend a little time talking about the network that we put together and sort of why it's a resource and why we did it. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about this whole concept of how we break down FSHD and sort of why are we doing it, what's real there, what isn't there, and what does it mean towards getting ready for clinical trials. And then if there's time at the end, I do want to talk about work we've been doing to try to build consensus to do a large multi-center study to prepare for clinical trials in children. So I mean, it's really, there's been a revolution in treatment. Like where I work at the University of Kansas Medical Center, back in 2010, we had about 20 clinical trials in neuromuscular disorders going on at the University of Kansas. And there was really only one FDA-approved drug. It was for Pompe disease. We now, at any given time, have over 70 active clinical trials in neuromuscular diseases. In many of these molecularly targeted therapies, they really sort of sound like science fiction, things like gene therapy, gene editing, RNA-targeted therapies, stem cells, but they're not science fiction anymore. This is just a list of FDA-approved drugs for neuromuscular disorders, over the last 9 to 10 years. The ones in red are molecularly targeted therapies. And I think it would have been hard to miss the recent news just a week or so ago about the gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy being approved for boys who are 4 to 5 years old. And for some of the diseases on this list, like spinal muscular atrophy, these treatments have literally changed what happens to people over time. They've changed the natural history of the diseases. This is the FSHD drug development landscape, and you guys probably have seen this before. This is taken straight off of the FSH Society website. I know certainly June's seen it, and this is just showing you companies that are working in the space. It sort of shows you how far along they are in the process. IND enabling means they're really still in the laboratory working with mice or animals in trying to prepare for clinical trials. When we think of clinical trials, we're usually thinking of these phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. It's worth pointing out we have 3 clinical trials active for FSHD right now, one Fulcrum Therapeutics, one from Roche, and one from Avidity Therapeutics. All of these companies have active trials right now. And then there's another stage that occurs after approval that's sometimes called phase 4. This is the post-marketing research. And so when I think about a drug development landscape, I kind of think of it in 2 ways. What kind of studies are being done? And right now in FSHD, we have both observational studies and interventional studies. So studies to learn about FSHD and studies to treat it. And what types of drugs are people working on? And these are just the classes of drugs that people typically think about. Small molecules is probably most of what we think about as drugs. This is stuff like Tylenol or ibuprofen. Biologics just mean that they're come from something biological that we've turned into a drug. RNA-based therapies, gene therapies, and cell therapies. And so when I think about FSHD, we have all types of studies going on in all classes of drugs. And so this raises the prospect for a very robust drug development pipeline. So now I just said we have got a very robust drug development pipeline, and you heard me in my introduction say there's still barriers that we need to overcome. And so you might be asking why. And the truth is for FSHD, but for many of the diseases that I work with, not just FSHD, but several rare neuromuscular diseases, we see this, where the pace of therapeutic development has really outpaced our efforts to prepare for the clinical trials. And so this leaves several gaps that we as a community need to be addressing. This is getting sites ready to run the clinical trials. I've already mentioned this. Refining our trial strategies, as well as building the tools that we're going to use to be able to tell if the drug's working or not in the setting of a clinical trial. Understanding the natural history, this is part of that. We have to know what happens to people when we don't treat them so we can understand what's different when we do. We have to understand the patient experience of living with the disease, and we haven't done a very good job of understanding this in the past. And then how do we handle, and this one may not seem like a problem, but how do we handle multiple studies running concurrently in a rare disease? And it turns out this is a bit of a dilemma, and it's become one for us even now. For many of the sites I'm working with have 3 clinical trials running simultaneously, and this can be quite difficult when there's only so many people who have the disease, and how do you keep that fair? And then there's the whole, what happens once the drug's approved? And so one way to deal with this is to create a clinical trial network to help address some of those gaps. And this is what me and my collaborators decided we were going to do. And it's very simplest sense. It's just a group of people, centers, academic institutions in my case, who agree to work together to prepare sites for clinical trials in our rare disorders. We're often trying to do something like increase the efficiency of these trials. We may be collecting biological samples. We'll be trying to learn about the disease or the things we don't know about it. There are several examples of this that are actually funded by our government. The Alzheimer's disease and cancer have large, networks that help address the need for new treatments, and the money for this really comes out of tax appropriations. But for other diseases and other areas, we don't have that, and so it's either academic groups or other funding sources that are supporting this. So, why form a network? The value-added proposition, we've sort of been circling it now the whole time I've been talking. It helps us expand our trial-ready sites so we can accommodate multiple studies. It gives us common rules for behavior and how people are going to collaborate. It helps us establish a process for the central ethics or regulatory review of what we're doing. This is certainly true in the United States. In other countries, you have to follow the rules of those countries. It helps us to train people so they're doing the same things in the same way. This is all the people who work on the studies, investigators, evaluators, coordinators, but most particularly for muscle disease, our evaluators. So much of what we're measuring is performance-based. It's how people do things. So we need to make sure if someone's measuring a 6-minute walk test in one center and a 6-minute walk test in another center, they're doing the same thing. We have to ensure the same data is collected in the same way. This is a similar concept, but slightly different. The way databases are set up, some of you have probably thought of doing this. Why can't we just collect all the data we've already done in clinic and just put it together? And you may have learned that there's subtle differences to how everyone's done it. And this makes it really hard to just pool it all together and analyze it. We have to identify and engage people who have the disorder. They're part of the process. We can't do this unless we're doing it as a group. We have to create these partnerships as well with industry who are making the drugs, build the tools, as I've mentioned, and then we want to create pooled resources ultimately that will accelerate the process. So the FSHD Clinical Trial Research Network, we actually formed it in 2016. This was with my mentor, the person who trained me, Robbie Twill, who's at the University of Rochester. At the time we put this together, there was nothing like this. And we just had 4 centers who, they kept hearing every meeting we would go to. We'd hear how we needed, there were things we needed to understand first before we could do clinical trials, but no one was doing the studies. And so we finally just said, we're just going to get together and start doing it. And we started with 4 sites back in 2016. We currently have, I think, 26 active centers in about 10 countries who are participating in the network. And so it's grown quite quickly. This is the goal of the network. It's to hasten therapeutic development and improve care for FSHD. You can see by the funding sources, we really have a broad array of people who are helping us do this, from single individuals to our foundations, up to groups like the NIH and our industry partners. People have been very good about helping us raise money to do this. I think we've gone through most of the things that our network is doing here, but I do want to mention one of them, which is training the next generation of researchers. This is a real issue in rare diseases. We need to have that next group who are going to come and carry on and do these studies when the people who are getting a little older, like me, start thinking about retirement. And so it's something that we as a field need to really be promoting. All right, so what are we doing on our network right now? We have 3 active studies that we're doing. The first one was called Clinical Trial Preparedness to Overcome Barriers to Drug Development in FSHD. You can tell that's a title that a physician probably made up. That was me. Everyone calls it Resolve. It was a longitudinal study in adults that included initially 240 individuals followed for 2 years. The study was expanded because of the pandemic to allow us to include another 80 subjects in Europe. This study is largely completed. It was mainly looking at measures of strength and function. These are the types of measures you would use for drug registration in a later phase study. And the data from the study is currently being used by lots of different companies. The follow-up to that we call MOVE. MOVE was a study to allow us to continue to follow some of the people who participated in Resolve and extend the time frame that we were following individuals. It was designed to be really more of a clinic-based protocol, so it would be a little easier to conduct. And we started to include individuals who were not initially included in Resolve. This included children as well as individuals who are no longer able to walk or people who had FSHD type 2. The study has been growing, and it was always meant to be a study that we could add pieces onto. One of the pieces we added onto it was whole body MRI and some biomarker work. And this was at the request of companies who were developing therapies who told us they needed to have this data to help do their clinical trials. And then we have a study called, it's a Wellstone funded study, but it's for MRI and muscle biopsies. This is really a discovery study. Some of the data that came out of this study, it's a small one, but some of the data that came out of it really sort of formed the basis for the design of clinical trials that we're seeing right now, certainly in our gene-targeted therapies. And it's part of the reason we're seeing people look at muscle biomarkers, MRI, and some of the outcomes that they're looking at. Many of you probably heard this expression, bench to bedside or lab to life. And it sounds very much like a single direction, like somehow we're going to learn something in the lab, we're going to get into clinical trials, right? And that's somehow the destination. But the truth is, when we're building these studies and we're thinking as a field and we're approaching clinical trials, this is not a destination, it's a cycle. And we're already seeing this happening. We need to be ready to react once the trials are going on to fill in the gaps. And we saw it when Fulcrum finished their phase 2 study and questions came up about things like whole body MRI and some of the biomarkers that we were using in the field, that we needed to be able to quickly pivot back, go back into studies and people and try to address some of the areas where we realized we don't really understand things as well. And so I think it's important to think about this as a cycle as we go forward. We're here to support these companies in these trials until we get therapies to help the people with FSHD. And this may be a process that will go on for a long time, because even if we have an effective therapy, the first ones are unlikely to just cure everything. And so we're likely going to want to be supporting this process for a long time. I should point out some of our other areas like spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne dystrophy. They've really been having trials going on for almost 2 decades before they really saw those breakthroughs occur. That doesn't mean we'll see that same time frame, but it does mean we should be prepared and have learned from their experiences. I want to take a little time now and sort of switch gears and think a little bit about pediatric FSHD. And sort of where are we at? What have we learned to date? And sort of why do we think we need another study to learn more? When we think about pediatric FSHD, this distinction is just, it's somewhat arbitrary. This idea that something changes when someone turns 18, it's not really true. These categories, we put them on things, right, after the fact. They're not inherent in a genetic disease. And if you look at the top right, this is just showing you a graphical illustration about when people are developing symptoms who entered our RESOLVE study. And if you look at it, it's got this shape that would be a pretty normal distribution, and it's really covering the whole lifespan from people just after birth until old age. And so you can see there's clearly people who are getting their symptoms start, at least at the point where they're noticing it and reporting it, all through the lifespan. If you just arbitrarily drew a line here, though, at 18, you'd see that really 40% of these people had symptoms at less than 18. That's a large number of people to be symptomatic there. Below this, I'm showing you data from our US registry. Some of you may be in the registry. What I've done here is a little different. I broke this out by genetics because some of you may have heard there's a relationship between the genetics and the age at which people are getting symptoms. And so this is a little different because this is the age at which people are diagnosed. The black line are individuals who have between 1 and 3 repeats. And what you may remember about FSHD, this is due to a deletion on chromosome 4. Normal people have more than 10 repeats. In FSHD, we see between 1 and 10.
Okay.
And you may have heard that people with 1 to 3 have a more severe disease, and you can see that illustrated here. If we look at that line about 18, you can see that 75% of people with 1 to 3 repeats, they're getting diagnosed before the age of 18. But even despite that, you can see with the other
Are
mutations,
you guys going up? You went to the place in up.
there's a significant number of individuals who are getting diagnosed at an early age. And so this kind of led to this concept that we might have a part of the disease that was more severe and getting symptoms at an earlier age. And this led to this definition of early onset, where people were having facial weakness before the age of 5, shoulder weakness before the age of 10. This is typically the current definition for early onset. And it's often quoted that about it's 1/5 of our patients get symptoms in childhood, although I've just shown you it's probably higher than that. And then about 1/2 may have early onset disease, but I'll show you as we go forward here that that's not so clear what's meant by that term. The other thing that came up that made us think, well, maybe there's something really different between some of the early onset patients and the rest of our population was when we looked at when people started to need a wheelchair. This was one of the first projects I ever did. I pulled this data out of the US registry. It was really simple. It asked people when their symptoms started. It asked them when they started to need to use equipment like a wheelchair and what age they were. And when we looked at this, we noticed something funny. One, it was sort of a higher percent than I would have anticipated. Although what you may have heard, which is that 20% of people over the age of 50 are needing a wheelchair, that's roughly true if you take the whole number together. But you can see if you break it out by decade, it's not linear like that. There's a group of people who are having to use wheelchairs at a very early age. This is the second decade, so this is between 10 and 20 years of age. And when we looked at those individuals and we looked at what mutations they had, these were the individuals with those 1 to 3 repeats who were getting their symptoms at a very young age. And so if you look at those individuals who are getting symptoms before the age of 10, and they have these 1 to 3 repeats, there is something different about them because a large percentage of them are needing a wheelchair within 10 years, where for everyone else, that's happening slowly over the course of the lifespan as they get older. Yeah, Debbie, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was just wondering, when you're looking at these and you're looking at the repeats, did you look at methylation at all? Does that factor into this, or is it just repeats size?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Two, no, we didn't look at methylation, and part of the reason we didn't look is we didn't have that value for the people in the registry at the time that we did this. We just had the standard commercial test, which all it really gave you was the number of repeats. Bronwyn?
Thank you. So I'm actually from Australia, and I saw on the chart that RCH, which is the Royal Children's Hospital, is in process of becoming part of the network. And I didn't quite know what in process meant.
So it's the process is just the timing for us to get people documents to sign. This is it's to join the network. They have to read the consortium agreement, which is the behavior of, how we're all going to collaborate together, and their institution actually has to sign it. This can usually requires lawyers at the institution. And then the studies themselves have their own agreements that are separate. And then we have to get those agreements drawn up as well. And so, yeah.
Michaela Walker, just a project manager with Dr. Statland on the study. We are actively working to add Melbourne as a site on the network and are working to get them on a study officially. So that is something we are collaborating with the group there. And there will be more to follow later, and happy to have you guys involved.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No, that's really good to know. And it was kind of odd because so the head of our pediatric neurologist at the Children's actually ended up becoming a politician halfway, like last year. So things have sort of shifted around in an odd way. But excellent. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so
I have a question for you, Dr. Statland, before you continue.
yeah, sure.
So they've some people have sort of thought of early onset as a different disease. We know it's not. It's the same disease. It's just a matter of when it presents. Some people, again, I know that methylation and other things play factors in this. Some people have 1 to 3 repeats, and they may not present until much later. Some people have more repeats and they present earlier. Like my son has a 7, he presented very early. So when the community thinks about early onset as something different, it's not really anything different, right? It's the same disease. It's just a matter of repeats, methylation, and whatever else maybe we don't know. It's a matter of when it presents. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I think you've hit on something that's actually unknown. I think there is a suggestion that there are a group of patients who are progressing much more rapidly, but our ability to identify who those people are before it happens, right? When we're seeing them when they're first coming to see us, we don't have that ability. In retrospect, when we look back, which most of this data is, it looks like there is a different group and they're behaving differently than what we might expect. But our ability to completely understand that, it's just not there. And part of the reason is we've just never had a study large enough that included enough children to really answer the question. But you're right. I think the question is there something different, or is this simply just the normal variation related to the disease that we're seeing? And that's a very good question. That's one I would like to have an answer to. I think the other reason that this comes up, because you're talking about it now, is because of the extramuscular manifestations. And so you may have heard that about 50% of people with FSHD have very subtle changes in the retinal vessels of their eyes. And this may be true, but a very small percentage, less than 1%, get a very severe syndrome called Coates syndrome that could really actually affect your vision. If it's caught and you don't treat it, you can lose your vision. And so it's a fairly serious condition. And that 1%, it turns out, tends to be this very early onset group, typically with the mutation size that's smaller, 1 to 3 repeats. The other area where we see this is with the hearing problems. Again, a problem that you can see a very subtle form of it in a larger number of patients, but there's a very severe presentation where people are often requiring hearing aids that's occurring at a very low frequency, somewhere between 1% and 5%. Again, typically in the same kids who are getting very early onset with the smaller genetic repeats. This is also part of why that question was raised. Is there something different about these patients that we don't understand? But I think your point you made earlier was right on the mark, that right now we just don't know exactly what's going to happen to someone, even if they have 1 to 3 repeats, because not everyone with 1 to 3 repeats gets the severe disease.
I have one more question while we're talking about hearing.
Yeah.
So a lot of, like my son included and other parents that I've talked to, some of the early indications of FSHD is high frequency hearing loss. And they have been referred to a lot of different doctors and diagnosed with different sort of conditions based on the hearing loss. And the question was asked, can we, as a community, the researchers, the doctors, educate doctors that can be a first indication of FSHD, and how do we go about doing that so that if someone takes their child in and they fail their hearing test either at birth or 3-year-old or whatever, that the doctors think, well, maybe I need to look further, that this might be an indication of FSHD. How do we get that on the doctor's radar so that they know to look for that or at least consider it?
That's a great question. In fact, one of the first really young children that I saw with FSHD, this was when I was in Rochester, you know, what they had no weakness at all. They just had the vision problem and the hearing problem. And their parents looked this up online and figured out what they had. No doctor was, you know, they were getting passed around from doctor to doctor. I think it's a great question. There are several efforts to try to do this. June's on right now, and I know she's got a master class she's put together that can help educate doctors on the you know, the different aspects of FSHD. There's effort underway right now to put together some international consensus guidelines to help guide people who are seeing FSHD patients to help them understand what they can see. Yeah, Debbie.
Can I?
Oh yeah, go ahead,
please,
Ellen.
go
You're
ahead.
I'm sorry. I actually reached out to Kathy Matthews because what's interesting here is, you know, newborn hearing, you know, screening is universal. That was put into effect, you know, a number of years ago. And so we looked up papers. There's kind of a decision tree for people doing the hearing screening. What do you do? And if you have binaural, you know, loss, then, you know, they think, you know, one of the things you can think is it might be genetic. And there's a slew of genetic tests that can be done, but these are sequencing tests. You just kind of look at the spelling of the DNA and look for the typos that are associated with hearing loss. Unfortunately, FSHD isn't picked up that way. I mean, FSHD2 might be, but FSHD type 1 won't show it. You know, you can't test for it that way. But if they're negative for that, I mean, you go down this decision tree and eventually there's like consider other genetic conditions. So I think it might be interesting we're trying to understand like what diseases get put on that list. And I think some of you have shared the experience that, you know, your child had this that picked up, but they looked at the list of possible genetic conditions and FSHD wasn't on it. So the question is, how do we get it on a list so that it, you know, it isn't up to the parents, you know, the parents shouldn't be the ones who, you know, are figuring it out on their own, be baked into this, you know, hearing screening process.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's something that would be interesting to do, but I think, as you know, this is going to be state dependent.
I know.
Yeah.
That's the bane of our federal system is health screenings are all, yeah, you'd have to do it on a state by state basis,
Yeah.
but maybe you could get a publication out or something that would cause all the states to say, oh yeah, we should do this, or I don't know. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. They need to have the information before they can make that decision. You know, if people out there don't know that this is something that would be good to be screened for, then of course they don't have the option to put it on.
Right.
So we need you guys to spread the word.
So I mean, we want to spread the word. It tends to be somewhat difficult with rare diseases to get the word spread broadly, but I mean, I think that you're right. The goal here is to get it on the differential, so when people see it, they can think about testing for it. And Debbie, I see you have a
Yeah, so I just still have my question. So when you say that the hearing and vision problems are very subtle, I'm wondering if we take our kids and have, because I can tell you my kid, you know, we've seen 6 specialists, you know, cardiologists, vision, you know, all of this stuff. How confident should we be that something you're describing as subtle would be picked up by these specialists? Like, is it so subtle that sometimes it's missed, or as long as, you know, we might miss it, but if we take it to the specialist, they're going to catch it?
I think what so it's going to depend a little bit on your child and on the mutation. The more severe problematic forms for hearing and for the vision tend to occur in the children who have the 1 to 3 repeats. And so for these children, I'll typically talk about annual screening. Hearing gets screened annually, usually through grade school if you enter the school system. And so that should be occurring. For most other individuals, the actual risk of having the symptomatic form, for example, of the eye condition is very remote. And so I think it's enough that they've had an eye exam, that their eye doctor's aware that the risk exists, and it would be a change in their vision is what would cue that. The subtle changes I'm talking about are very difficult to see. Most ophthalmologists aren't going to be able to see these very subtle changes. They require a type of test that has a little bit of a risk to it, putting a dye into the vessels of the eye. And you have to know what you're looking for to allow that dye to infiltrate out into the periphery. It's not going to be important unless the vision is starting to change, and at that point then there's a treatment, and that would be the point where you would want to make sure it was being captured.
Okay, so if we keep, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but if your child does have the 1 to 3 repeats, I think what's important is you tell the eye doctor about the association so they know what they're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna get back here. I'm really almost done with slides. These are some of the studies that were done specifically recently for children with FSHD, and they're sort of here to support the reason why we really need to get together and do a larger study to help prepare for clinical trials. And they're bringing up many of the issues you're all bringing up right now. There was a fairly large effort to look at early onset FSHD by a group called Synergy, who had done some large studies in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they were able to get 52 individuals in their study, but over most of the individuals were no longer children. So they were able to get individuals who had a childhood onset, but who were now adults into the study. And I think partially because of this, when you look at what they found out, it was only a single time point. It wasn't as helpful as you would hope it would be. They were able to see that facial weakness was one of the common early presenting signs for a more severe version of FSHD if it was prominent. But they really weren't able to find any other risk factors for what happened to the individuals over time. There was another study that was done by the Dutch group. The Dutch have done a nice job of looking at children in their country. They have a very centralized system that helps allow for this. They did one sort of what's called a case control study, where they were able to show that the earlier you have symptoms, the more severe the disease will be, independent of genetics or other factors. And what they found was the separation was occurring probably a little earlier than had previously been thought. That sort of shoulder weakness before the age of 10 seemed a little bit old for this. It was really patients who were getting quite weak by the age of 8, where that division was occurring. It turns out the individuals who had those small number of repeats were entirely in that group, in this group of patients that they looked at. And these people with the very early onset were also the ones who had some of those extramuscular manifestations. However, in a way, this was contradicted by a study they did to follow it up, where they then did a longitudinal study. They entered children in this study and they followed them now for up to 5 years. It originally had 32 children enrolled and 9 of them met the criteria for early onset. But over time, they unfortunately lost some of the children. So at the point where they were getting the follow-up visits occurring, they were down to 13 who came in for those in-person assessments, which is a very small number. And basically what they saw is they were really not able to show the distinction between the early onset and sort of the other childhood onset cases in here. Let me just sort of walk you through this. Each of these dots is an individual. If they're connected, it's the same person at different points in time. They followed people for 2 years. If you look on the top left, this is just a score that physicians give patients when we see them that sort of tells you how much of the body is involved. The higher the score, the more weakness someone has. Typically, as you get up to a score of 15 on this, you're having to use a wheelchair. And I think what you can see, one, the group that they followed over time were, a lot of them were more mildly affected, right? They're down here at the bottom of that scale. So a lot of the people who entered really weren't that weak. 2, now they all went up. So notice these are all increasing in score for the most part. This would suggest that the disease is getting more severe, but I'm going to show you as we go through some of the other things they measured, these things didn't always agree. The light blue color here, these are the early onset kids, and the dark blue are just childhood onset. If you look at the next thing over, this is something that we call the motor function measure. This is a whole series of activities that you have a child do. Getting up from a chair, running a short distance, stepping up on a step, a whole series of 32 items that you have someone do and you give them scores. Those scores can range from you do it normally, you do it with compensations, to you can't do it at all. If you look, they normalize this to 100%. 100% would be someone doing everything normal. And I think you can see the problem they had here as they followed this over time. All the kids were doing all the tasks normally for the most part. And so this wasn't a very good way to measure these kids with FSHD over time, right? We weren't going to see a lot of changes in these kids. They were essentially doing the tasks okay. And that stayed true despite the fact that when the clinician saw them, they said that severity changed in the patient. In the bottom left, you can see another way that we measure function in children. This is something you've probably heard about from clinical trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's called the 6-minute walk test. It's how far a child can walk in 6 minutes. Typically, they've normalized it here, so a score of 0 would be normal. The negative score means it's slightly below normal, but notice that almost all of the children increased in their score over a 2-year period. Again, despite the fact that you saw the severity in the terms of the physician going up, these children were improving in performance. This is a known factor when we're thinking about children in clinical trials. You have to remember your child is developing and developing skills at the same time that the muscle disease is changing. And so the way this happens over time isn't unidirectional. It's not like the kids are just going to lose function. What you typically see is a U-shaped curve. Kids are gaining function and they're learning how to do things until they reach a certain age, and then you see it start to shift and they start to lose those abilities. You can see in this group, they just didn't follow it out long enough, and there weren't enough kids to really see that evolution occurring. Michael?
Hi, Jeff. Thank you very much for the presentation, and I appreciate the FSHD Society putting this on and organizing it too. With respect to the U-shaped curve, is it not correlated to the presence of human growth hormone? So, we often hear a lot about patients as their hormones change, they have significant clinical events. And based on my experience as a kid and certainly working in the field, as you know, and engaging with a lot of patients, I would bet that the kids are somewhat protected by the presence of HGH early on.
I mean, you're asking a good question, because remember, a lot's happening as they're getting older.
Mm-hmm.
And we know in FSHD, as people hit puberty, something happens because men and women sort of separate out on the age that they're getting diagnosed at that point. But it's very hard to know for children, because if you're really 7 and under, there's sort of learning the language, learning to follow the rules and do the things that people are asking you to do. There's a whole element that's just educational that's going on. There's a physical aspect that's going on. And it's hard to know when those inflection points are. What I'd say in FSHD, I have no idea. We just have never had a study with enough children in it followed for a long enough period of time to answer the question.
Yeah. And I have one more comment from a few slides back. Is it fair to say that nearly all of the FSHD patients have subclinical retinal changes? So, you talk about finding FSHD, and similar to other rare diseases, you can often pick it up on optometry and ophthalmological exams. So, I think, just because the physicians miss it, it doesn't mean that patients can't be diagnosed earlier. I don't have the solution on how to educate physicians, but I would say most.
Yeah, the number, this has been a little bit of a controversial issue. There was an old study where they suggested up to 50% of people could have subtle changes on fluorescein angiography, which is really an older technique for looking at the vessels. This was people have tried to repeat this study and they were unable to repeat it and get similar results, but part of the problem may have had to do with how long they let the dye sit in the eye before they were taking the photographs. And they may not have let the dye seep out long enough to get to the periphery of the retina. There are newer techniques, optical tomography can actually look at this. These techniques just haven't been done yet. But I mean, I think as we move towards the future, we should consider doing these techniques.
Yeah, I mean, I think and Michaela and a few others on the phone, I have FSHD and I work in the field. And I ran part of Genzyme's rare disease business. We spent a lot of time talking to ophthalmologists and optometrists about Fabry disease and MPS, because there was corneal whirling, and often it would be picked up on a standard slit exam. So, just a thought.
I think this is something you should say. One thing I always do tell people is you do need to tell your, physician what you have and what the association is with FSHD, because your average ophthalmologist may or may not be aware of these associations. They likely will have learned about Coates syndrome in their career, but they probably haven't learned about the association with FSHD. And so it would be important to educate them so they know what they're looking for.
Yeah, and then June, another comment, that the best people to pick up FSHD are gym teachers, as we've talked about before, right? Like you put a 4-year-old kid in the middle of a gymnasium and have them run around. It's pretty evident if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. No, that's another thought we've had. It's just a matter of and we might want to team up with other neuromuscular diseases, like how to spot possible condition in a child, and then do a training with, but hundreds of thousands of gym teachers. I mean, there's probably a way to do it. It's, but
all of us on this call can spot it. Like when we're in a shopping mall or walking around outside and you see a kid with a neuromuscular disease, we all look at that kid and say, wow, there's something different about that. And I think it would be great to see the FSHD Society have a focused education program with early educators.
Doesn't almost every kid have a hard time with sit-ups? There's like the whole sit-up thing. I mean, I feel like that's like the history. No, I don't know. Heard that with a lot of people, and I can tell you, my kid couldn't do it to save her life. So,
well, I couldn't do a sit-up. I could never do a push-up.
A couple things. We talked about this here because I was going to go out into the community to give talks to try to identify people earlier. Just a few things. Your talk has to encompass a whole spectrum of diseases, because they won't just be exposed to one dystrophy. They'll be exposed to them all. And the teachers you're talking to have to be open to it, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky. Open to learning and participating in that. We tried to organize it here. The pandemic hit, which certainly made that a more difficult thing to try to do. But we're still going to try to reach out and figure out ways to have better community outreach to catch people earlier. Getting back to clinical trials for kids, because I know there's a lot of people interested in clinical trials for kids. I think one of the questions that comes up now is what's going to be the right thing to measure in FSHD if we're having clinical trials in children. This is work that Katie Duvall from Melbourne did. She's a physical therapist. She looked at a number of different types of outcome measures and looked to see how children with FSHD were performing on them. And just a couple things to point out. Some of the standard ones that are used in children, the motor function measure is used in Europe. I've already shown this to you because I showed it to you on another slide. I think the problem with this measure, and you can see it here, is that the kids are basically bunching up at the top. And so it doesn't have the breadth to see changes. If you're already performing at the top of the scale, and we give you some treatment, you can't see someone get better if they're already maxed out. The same would be true for something called the performance upper limb, which is a standard test in Duchenne to look at the shoulder and arm movement. We see the same issue, though. Many of our kids are maxing out on the scale. And so while it might be an okay scale at a certain point in the disease, it's certainly not a good initial scale. Over here, you can see why there's been interest in this FSHD functional composite, because you don't get the kids bunching up at the bottom or the top of the scale, which gives it good room to capture the changes that might be occurring in FSHD. And so I think, the question, maybe we'll just leave it with this, which is why do we need to do a multi-center study? Because this is what I've been arguing for, and I've been trying to organize now for the last year. We're doing this in collaboration with the Australian group in Melbourne, who are working with us to try to get this to happen. The reasons why, we've really only had few studies that have followed children over time. I've shown you one of them here, the Dutch study, and I showed you the problem, which was that many of those kids didn't come back for the follow-up appointments. And it was only a single study. The Melbourne group as well has followed kids, but they have the same issue, which is a small number who came back over time. Our more severe early onset form of FSHD may be an important group for disease modifying therapies, but also to advance our understanding of the disease. There's clearly things we don't know that we need to learn about the disease. Some of the treatments that are being proposed, things like AAV delivered gene therapies, these are therapies that are more feasible in children if they're very young, but you would only consider them if you thought you had a child who was going to have a very rapidly progressing disease because of the risk of giving the therapy. And so there's a risk-benefit assessment that would need to occur. The only way for us to answer this question and know would be to do a study where we follow kids over time and we learn what are those factors that are telling us whether one of our kids is doing okay, or one of the kids is going to have a lot of trouble in the next year or two. As with many of the different diseases we see, examining the more extreme cases, younger, older, smaller mutations, larger mutations, this is how we learn about diseases and learn about possible therapies. So there's a lot to be learned from doing this. And in general, with disease-targeted therapies, there's a concept that starting earlier is going to be better. And so I think if we have a disease-targeted therapy, we would very much rather start treating someone before they became weak as opposed to waiting until they've had muscle damage to start treating them. And in our situation with the network, we already have 15 sites up and running a study. And so for us, it's really an opportunity now to leverage the work we've already done to allow us to start to run this study and collect the data in a larger number of children than they've ever really been able to look for. So we're hoping to run a study in 80 children who we follow for at least 2 years.
Dr. Statland, I have a question about this study. So what are the barriers, do you believe, for getting the 80 kids? I mean, I have my ideas of what they might be. First of all, are the kids tested? Do they have to have a genetic test? Are the parents testing the kids and getting a genetic test to know that they do have FSHD to confirm it before they go? And then also, are the sites equipped to handle pediatrics? Like, I have heard through the parent group that they'll try to call and get their kids in, and they say, we don't do pediatrics, or we won't take anybody under a certain age. So those are the two things that I see, that I hear about. What do you think those are the two main barriers, or what other barriers do we have to get these kids in here to get them studied?
Well, so I mean, we have 26 sites. So several of our sites are pediatric sites, like Nationwide Children's in Iowa, the pediatric center there. And so we have enough centers that are pediatric that we should be able to do this study. We have other centers that see both children and adults. I think we've had some individuals that we've had physicians who've moved from one center to another. And unfortunately, the physicians often determine whether they're seeing the kids or not at the center. So if someone leaves the center, that can leave us with a center that maybe was seeing children but isn't anymore. But in our network, we certainly have enough centers that primarily see kids. It is a problem of numbers. And so even at our really large pediatric centers, the number of kids who are still young is low. And so we may have some difficulty getting to that number of 80. The largest centers we have about 15, maybe as high as 20, but these are centers that are referral centers where people are coming from fairly large areas to come in and be seen. Many of our centers are referral centers. I think our plan to try to overcome this as a barrier is to offer money to help people travel to centers if they're willing to do it. But the other way to deal with that is to add more centers. We're going to start with a certain number and see if we can achieve our goals. If we can't, one solution would be just to add more centers and cover a broader area.
What about the issue of kids, like in families where FSHD is generational, but kids, they kind of sort of know that the kids have it, they may suspect they have it, but they haven't actually been tested for it. Therefore, they can't go into a trial.
Yeah, so the genetic testing is, I think, a problem for our field. There's a few ways that solutions may be found. There is a less expensive test that's in the process of trying to be made commercial ready. If that would happen, that would be one way to have a solution for that. June, if she's still on, can talk about work they're doing to try to raise funds to provide free testing. Again, and then we can provide testing as part of our research. The only issue with us providing testing as part of research is it's typically then a research test. And so it doesn't work quite the same as having a commercial test in terms of the next study that your child may want to go into.
Yeah, no, we had sponsored test that we ran last year. We had industry funding to cover the full cost of genetic counseling and testing and the blood draw, all the things that required to really take you through from, beginning to end of actually getting the test. And that was very successful. People signed up pretty quickly and we went through all the funds that were available. So we want to start that program up again. We're raising funds for it. So, but that at the time, it was limited to people who are trial eligible because the focus and the reason
it didn't include children.
Right, it didn't include children, but that could change if there is there's a strong case to be made for why to test children as children.
I mean, I think from my point of view, it's very challenging to raise money to do studies this large. We're working on trying to get that funds. Once you get the funds and start the study, sometimes it's much easier to get people to buy in and add some money. So, I mean, if we're having trouble with the genetic testing, we may raise funds just to try to do the testing for people.
And just to point out, I mean, clinical trials are a little bit of a different story. Genetic test is typically required, but right now for our studies, it's genetic test or they have to have a clinical diagnosis with another family member who has the disease. That for our studies just ensures that we're actually studying someone with FSHD versus another neuromuscular condition, because there are a lot of other neuromuscular conditions they could have. And that's just important when you're doing a study.
I do want to just say something here. So all of the companies who are running clinical trials, just so you know this, have included genetic testing in their screening. So all three of our companies that have done this are providing genetic testing if people don't have it as part of the screening process. So I think if we have a company that's offering a treatment trial, it's likely going to be included in their screening process if a child didn't have it.
Well, that's good to know, Michaela. I'm glad you said that. So if a parent wants to bring their child to a natural history study, the MOVE or MOVE Plus, their child doesn't have to be genetically diagnosed. If they've been clinically diagnosed and they have FSHD in their family, they can come in and do the MOVE study. So
Yeah,
I just want to make sure that's well known, that it doesn't have to be, because I think sometimes they get caught in a catch-22. They know that it's in the family, but they're not showing signs yet that the doctors, they won't clinically diagnose them or whatever, so don't give them the genetic test even though they think they need it. So if we want to get ahead of it, like if we want to get ahead so that children can get treatments before they start showing signs, they're obviously going to have to get tested before they start showing signs. So this is a good workaround that if it's in the family and they go get clinically diagnosed, like, yeah, it's in my family, they're showing these signs, and the neurologist is aware, I think they could get clinically diagnosed fairly quickly. You agree?
Go ahead, Dr. Statland.
Yeah, I mean, typically that's true. But I'm not going to say always, because it does depend where you live and who you're seeing.
I just wanted to mention one thing, if you don't mind. I think one of the things that I had noticed, because I had talked to a lot of families to see, I was sort of on this mission to spread the word about MOVE. And I think one of the things that was hard is that parents often don't want to have this on their medical record. And so it's kind of tough, because either way, like if they did a research diagnose or a test that's just research, then they have that information, but it's not on the medical record. If they did like the Utah or Iowa, I'm sorry, that's going to go on the medical record. If you have it in your family and you see all the symptoms and you know your kid has FSHD, it's not on the medical record. But if you go to a neurologist and it's clinically diagnosed, well, then it's on the medical record. So I think I just kind of wanted to mention that, as like, I really think that that's a really big barrier. And I think especially when it's been in families for a long time, because they know that that's what it is. And they also, unfortunately, know that right now there's not something that they can give their kids. So
yeah, I mean, I think this usually changes when there's something we'll do differently. So having treatments would be one part of that, and access to clinical trials could potentially change someone's opinion about doing that. But you're right. Typically for kids, it's we're going to do something differently with information, and that's either to reach out to the school to help get school programs, or get access to some kind of a treatment.
And then just to reiterate before Dr. Statland finishes up, specifically like for our study for MOVE, what we're talking about, other studies can make whatever criteria they want to, but for ours, it's right now for MOVE, you either have to have a genetic test, or you're clinically diagnosed with, a parent or a sibling or somebody else in your family that has FSHD. So that, again, just kind of ensures that we're studying an individual that has the disease and not limb-girdle muscular dystrophy or myotonic or some other potential neuromuscular condition. So that is for the MOVE study, just to hit home on that again. But other studies could be different.
wait, Michaela, I'm sorry. Can I just clarify that? I think you said that someone in the family has to be clinically diagnosed.
Yeah. Well, someone else has to have FSHD, whether it's a parent or a sibling, or it has to be some sort of direct relative.
Okay, so let's say I had the genetic test and I have FSHD, and then I start seeing some symptoms, I start seeing symptoms in one of my kids. That child would not have to be clinically diagnosed?
They still have to be, they either need to be genetically diagnosed or clinically diagnosed.
Okay. All right.
So
And
the physician would have to see them and just document that they have some signs of the disease. That could be coming in to see someone who's a specialist, or it could be someone in your area, whatever, whoever would be seeing them.
And just to be clear, because I really trying to get kids in this study, and I think I know the answer, but they would not be able to come to one of your sites and be diagnosed by one of your neurologists to be included in the study and not have it on their medical record. I mean, there's no way around it. It would have to be in their medical record.
They could come in and screen. I mean, as long as the parent was involved and we were told that that the child had the symptoms, they would come in and screen. There would be a slight chance for a screen failure if the person seeing them didn't see the signs, though.
Okay, I'm just thinking, but all the people at your sites are these FSHD specialists, so maybe
we have a pretty good group of specialists. and so we try to train everyone who's
Okay.
in our studies so they can they're becoming, experts in seeing these signs. That's part of what training for our study is providing for them.
Well, I mean, I just sort of, from my experience, it seems to me like somebody who has seen at least a few people with FSHD and they're trained to do the MOVE study would have a better chance of diagnosing than, I'm in Michigan and, our doctor has seen 2 cases. So
no, to get in the study, I think that's true. I should just point out though, to get like a formal diagnosis, because you need it. It's a research visit is typically can't be used for that particular purpose. But to get in the study, they can come in.
okay.
And you won't take kids under 5, is that right, Dr. Statland?
We are taking kids under 5. It's likely what we're going to be getting at that case is more of the questionnaire.
We do MRIs or biopsies or anything like that, though. That would probably be like 5 and up, probably not like littles.
Okay, so if you're under 5, you can join the study, but mostly questionnaires. They may have to sit down and get up or something like that, but no MRI or anything. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think, wouldn't that be nice to get that group of kids though? Because then we have, a longer part of their lifespan and
yeah,
and
I mean, I think
really like early stages. I feel like they're kind of the golden people to get started with them before things get so.
I think there's a lot of interest in having us include so the original age range we were thinking of for the study was 5 to 18. This age range had to do with the ability to do the actual testing. There's been a lot of people telling us they would like us to enter kids who are younger for just the reasons you're saying. I think our tendency would be to go ahead and enter these kids so we can follow them, understanding that they'll likely not be able to consistently do some of the measures though until they get a little older.
Like with a 3-year-old, it's kind of get what you get and don't throw a fit. So as far as the testing, but I think we'd be like open to collecting whomever would want to enroll, but probably understand that they're not going to do the whole body MRI or reachable workspace or, things like that. And probably not the blood draw.
So I think that's important that, and I think June said this to me and it really resonated with me that you should take the kids where they are. And wherever they're at in their journey, you should just take them because there's so few of them. Whatever age you get them, whatever condition you get them, ambulatory, non-ambulatory, we need to take them wherever they are.
And so we're going to try to be as inclusive as possible. The trial funding has its own sort of limitations to it. Like I said, once we have the study open, we can broaden this usually and be more inclusive. At that point, to actually get the funding though, to start the study, we'll likely have to put some barriers on the age range that would fit for the criteria that most companies are going to use as they're doing their studies.
When do you expect this study would start for the pediatric?
Yeah, so I think for the study we're talking about right now, we're literally submitting for the funding in the next few weeks. So I suspect that we'll see a pilot version starting at least a few of our centers earlier because we want to be able to run through the protocol and make sure that things are working well and how we would expect them to. We're also going to be starting to collect healthy children at different ages to help us understand the performance of our FSHD kids when they're in this study. I suspect the pilot versions will be starting this summer. The actual study itself, probably the earliest that we could get funded from the NIH would be at mid-year. Now, if we get funding from another source that could allow us to start earlier, we would do that.
So if a parent wanted to get their child enrolled in this study, what would they need to do?
They just need to reach out to us and let us know.
Reach out to me, and then I will try to connect them with the nearest site that is, ready to go.
And if they really wanted to be in the pilot portion, they could let us know, and we would we could try to make that happen.
So you don't know which sites were going to be included in the pilot study at this time?
Because the pilot funding is likely going to come from it'll be unfunded. It'll come from money that I have from doing other work. So it'll likely be the KU site, the Rochester site to start with. We might expand it to one additional site to allow us to start getting those numbers up. And then once it opens, we'll have a broader distribution.
So I have a question about that, Dr. Statland. So my daughter has not done MOVE yet. We have an appointment in September, and that's in Ohio. So that would be a different study than what you're talking about now.
That you can enter the MOVE study, and then you would be able to move into this study. So our expectation is the largest difference is going to have to do with some outcome measures that are not currently in MOVE. This will include the MRI study, and it'll include the reachable workspace with the 3D camera. If your child's in MOVE and they would like to do the expanded study, they would just enter it at the next time they came in.
Okay, is there any benefit to waiting?
Because it's an observational study, I don't know that there's a benefit to waiting, because the more data we have, and ultimately it'll be better. We'll be able to connect those data points up in time, and while we won't have everything the same, we'll have all of the functional and strength testing that we'll be able to continue to follow. And so that would be quite helpful.
Okay, we've gone over time. We appreciate your time, Dr. Statland. Is there any other last minute pressing questions? If you think of something later, you see this on YouTube and you have a question, you can email me at the Early-Onset Chapter at fshdsociety.org, and I will get that to one of these experts to answer those questions for you. Appreciate your time, Michaela and Dr. Statland, June, and everybody else who attended tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.